there's a lot of moving parts to this story. So just before we get into the characters that are involved here, can you just explain, where these accusations happened?
Yeah, so it's quite complicated in the sense of this was a relative of the victim as well. So a lot of this was in other locations, but some of the allegations relate to abuse at Exodus premises in Coleraine at the time, and it would have been the late 90s when the victim was aged between 12 and 16. His cousin, Jonathan Hyndman, was a youth leader in Exodus, and so that's where some of the abuse took place. But obviously, given it was familial abuse, there are other aspects of it as well.
And for people who might not know what Exodus is, it's kind of associated with that Bible Belt of Northern Ireland. It's not really a church and it's not really directly linked to the PCI. So what actually is it?
No, so it was a youth initiative. It was actually it was established to see generations of young people boldly following Jesus and becoming lifelong disciple makers. That was its mission statement when it was founded in 1997. It was founded by Norman and Linda Linus, but also Jim Brown and as co-founder. And it was basically just to meet the needs of young people, and it was really taken, I suppose, from the story of Exodus in the Bible in the Old Testament. Kind of Moses leading his people out of slavery. That kind of idea that this would give an alternative to young people, alternative nightlife, I suppose, being a key aspect of it.
So Ross Hunter, who is the victim of this story, he's 39 now. So this is now historical abuse. So can you just take me through the beginning of his claims?
Yeah, so Ross, I say, would have been between 12 and 16 when this happened. As some of the abuse was in the home and in kind of that family context. But his cousin, Jonathan Henman, was a youth leader in their local church, which is also the victim's church, which was First Dumbo Presbyterian Church in Ardclave. Now, none of the abuse happened in that church. There's no allegations that there was abuse, but Jonathan Hyndman played a role as a youth leader at Exodus. The victim described him as the right-hand man of Jim Brown, the CEO. So we'll come to Jim Brown a bit more later, but the abuse itself would have been when the victim was aged between 12 and 16. We're talking the late 1990s, but he didn't come forward until 2009 when he was 22 was when he first spoke out about it. Speaking out about it involved him going to the PSNI and reporting it to the police. He also says he reached out to the minister, First Dumbo Presbyterian Church, the then minister, who's now retired, the Reverend James McCacken. And he says the minister took no tangible action but promised to pray for him. And then it was actually 2 years later, it was in July 2011, that the victim emailed Jim Brown, the CEO of Exodus. And in that email, he says, "Don't know if you remember me, but I used to go to Exodus." And then he said about Jonathan Hyndman and a bit about what he'd been through and what he'd suffered as a result of being abused. Now, he doesn't state in that email that the abuse happened in Exodus. And again, we'll come to that later in terms of Exodus' latest response. But I suppose he's telling the CEO of Exodus that Jonathan Hyndman had abused him, and Jim Brown would have known Jonathan Hyndman was a youth leader at Exodus. So it warranted follow-up questions and serious follow-up anyway. And that didn't appear to happen because the victim, Jim Brown, in his response said that he was abroad for the next 2 months, but would be happy to meet on his return. And I think that upset Mr. Hunter because he felt that this was a serious allegation he was levelling and that it required an urgent response. He was also struck by the lack of, I suppose, what he would say is the sincere concern for him, but also, and this is what the victim is most concerned about, the absolute lack of concern for other victims or other potential victims. Nobody was wondering, or wonder if there's more. I suppose that's relevant in the context of Mr. Hunter saying he doesn't believe he was the only one. He doesn't believe that he was the only person that Jonathan Hyndman was abusing during that time period.
In terms of Jonathan, what would his position have been? How high up would he have been in the church or in Exodus even?
So as I say, the victim described him as the right-hand man of Jim Brown. From my understanding, it would have been in a voluntary capacity, so it wouldn't have been in any official capacity, but he did lead summer camps and kind of youth events, was heavily involved in youth projects. He went on to become a PSNI officer. so I suppose would have been inside of his work, but I don't have absolute clarity on that because Exodus, Jim Brown has not replied to queries. He hasn't, although we got a response post publication yesterday. They didn't answer the most pertinent questions, I suppose.
What did they not answer?
So PCI, X is not directly linked to PCI, but it does have strong links to, I suppose, multiple denominations across Northern Ireland. But so there is that kind of overlap because it's not a denomination in and of itself. So it does have input and certainly involvement of Presbyterian ministers in it over the years. So the PCI were contacted in relation to the victim approaching his then minister, Reverend James McCahan, to see what they did at that point. Because again, there's a question, if the victim saying he doesn't believe he was the only one does raise the potential, or at least warrants the question, was he doing it in the church? So he would have expected people to be asking that at the time, and an effort, I suppose, in place to identify other victims and offer support to anyone else who may have been affected. But he says the lack of action and the promise to pray for him, he takes that as that there was no actual follow-up there. So that's where he feels let down by PCI. And again, what I said, there was no abuse in that church by this, by Mr. Hunter, at least. Where then Exodus comes into play is because some of the abuse did take place on those premises. He contacted Jim Brown, and again, the same response. In Jim Brown's response, Jim Brown offered to meet up with him in 2 months because he was travelling, but then now the victim admits he was in a bad place. He hadn't been to therapy. He's in a good place now, but he wasn't in a good place then. He was angry at the response and he didn't follow it up in 2011. But again, in hindsight now, I suppose with the benefit of therapy and being in a better place, in light of the safeguarding scandal engulfing the Presbyterian Church, he's looking back and thinking, well, that wasn't actually a satisfactory response from Jim Brown, just to offer to meet up with me in 2 months, say, I'm abroad, I can meet you in 2 months. And then when he didn't meet him, there was, again, no follow-up, no attempt or no apparent attempt that we know of to ask the questions of, did Jonathan Hyndman do this to other people? Are there other people? And what is the extent of this? And also just, again, it's that absolute lack of support and concern for Ross Hunter himself, who'd come forward quite vulnerable and broke his silence, I suppose, his long-held silence, that by keeping the secret, his own life had started to spiral out of control, and then he came forward, and that was a huge step in his journey, I suppose, to get into where he is now, to a better place. But it was just that absolute lack of support from Exodus and from PCI, and then that's complicated too by the fact that he also reported the PSNI. John Henman was a serving police officer at the time. PSNI did launch a criminal investigation, and that ended obviously when John Hyndman took his own life, because PSNI, from their perspective, there was no prospect of criminal prosecutions, and that seems to have been the end of it. The PSNI said they can't comment on specific or individuals because the PCI investigation's ongoing, but that's overlap. So Mr. Hunter feels let down by the PSNI, Presbyterian Church in Ireland, and Exodus, or at least Exodus CEO Jim Brown.